In the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, a 62-year-old widow was about to teach her daughter-in-law the most important lesson of her life. What started as a family barbecue took a shocking turn when Charlotte Langley came face to face with public humiliation that would change everything. Charlotte wasn't your typical grieving widow quietly fading into the background. For 35 years, she had built a life of quiet strength and community respect. Known for her sharp mind and unshakable dignity, that her daughter-in-law Jessica had dangerously underestimated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning held that particular Ohio crispness that Charlotte Langley had always loved, air that whispered of changing seasons and carried the scent of dying leaves, mixed with the last stubborn blooms in her garden. She knelt beside the chrysanthemums that Robert had planted 3 autumns ago, their bronze and gold faces turned toward the pale sun like faithful congregants in prayer. Her fingers worked methodically, pulling weeds with the same careful precision she'd once used to grade essays, though now the task served a different purpose entirely. In the years since Robert's funeral, gardening had become her meditation, her way of staying connected to the man who'd built this sanctuary with his own hands. The sound of car doors slamming shattered the morning quiet. Charlotte looked up from the flower bed, squinting against the sun to see David's silver Honda pulling into the driveway, followed by a yellow U-Haul truck that seemed far too large for what was supposed to be a brief visit. Her heart did that little skip it always did when her son arrived, a mixture of joy and worry that had defined motherhood for 31 years. But today the skip was accompanied by a flutter of unease. She rose slowly, brushing soil from her gardening gloves, and watched as David climbed out of the driver's seat with the slumped shoulders of defeat she recognized from his teenage years. Jessica emerged from the passenger side like a cat stepping delicately around puddles, her designer boots clearly unsuited for gravel driveways. Even from this distance, Charlotte could see the tension in her daughter-in-law's posture, the way she surveyed the house with the calculating gaze of someone taking inventory. "Mom," David called, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that parents learn to decode like a foreign language. He jogged toward her with arms outstretched, and Charlotte felt herself slip automatically into the role of welcoming mother, setting aside her questions for the warmth of his embrace. "What a wonderful surprise," she said against his shoulder, meaning it despite the growing knot in her stomach. David had always been her gentle boy, the one who brought home wounded birds and cried over roadkill. But the man in her arms felt different somehow, diminished, as if life had worn away some essential part of him. "I'm sorry we didn't call ahead," he murmured, not quite meeting her eyes. "Things happened kind of suddenly." Jessica approached with measured steps, her smile bright and brittle as fresh ice. "Charlotte, you look wonderful." "Doesn't she look wonderful, David?" Without waiting for an answer, she air-kissed Charlotte's cheek, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume that made Charlotte think of department store cosmetic counters. "We're so grateful you can put us up for a few days while we figure things out." The phrase, "figure things out," hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, visible but not yet threatening. Charlotte's teacher instincts, honed by decades of reading between the lines of student excuses, picked up on the careful way Jessica avoided specifics. "Of course, dear. You're always welcome here." Charlotte's voice carried the automatic warmth of Midwestern hospitality, even as her eyes cataloged the boxes visible through the Honda's rear window, the way David kept glancing at the U-Haul, as if it might disappear if he looked away long enough. "Let me help you bring things in." "Actually," Jessica said, her voice gaining that particular edge that Charlotte was learning to recognize, "we should probably talk about sleeping arrangements first. I noticed when we were here for Christmas that the guest room still has that vintage wallpaper, and the mattress felt a bit soft. I have a sensitive back, you understand." Charlotte blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the criticism wrapped in concern. The guest room had been Robert's den before they'd converted it after his first heart attack 5 years ago, thinking they might need a bedroom on the ground floor. The wallpaper, a subtle pattern of cornflowers on cream, had been her choice, selected during happier times when she'd imagined grandchildren visiting, maybe staying for weeks during summer breaks. "I'm sure we can make it comfortable," Charlotte said carefully. "I have extra pillows and—" "Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine for now," Jessica interrupted with a wave of her manicured hand. "We can always make improvements later. David, shouldn't you start unloading?" David flinched slightly at his wife's tone, but moved toward the truck with the resignation of someone who'd learned that resistance only prolonged the inevitable. Charlotte watched him go, noting the way his shoulders curved inward, and felt something sharp twist in her chest. This wasn't the confident young man who'd graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State, who'd landed his dream job in software development, who'd called her just 6 months ago to crow about his latest promotion. "David lost his job," Jessica said quietly, as if reading Charlotte's thoughts. "Layoffs. The whole tech sector is a mess right now." Her voice carried a mix of sympathy and impatience that made Charlotte wonder who, exactly, Jessica blamed for their current circumstances. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry." Charlotte reached out instinctively, but Jessica had already turned away to examine the front porch with a critical eye. "These steps are getting pretty worn," Jessica observed, running her toe along a crack in the concrete. "And the porch light fixture looks like it's from the 70s. Very nostalgic." The word nostalgic landed like a small slap. Charlotte looked at the fixture, a simple brass lantern that Robert had installed when they'd first moved in 36 years ago, and saw it suddenly through Jessica's eyes. Not charming or well-maintained, but dated, old-fashioned, an embarrassment. "Your father always said that fixture would outlast us both," Charlotte said, surprised by the defensive note in her own voice. "Well, that's the thing about old houses," Jessica replied with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They require so much maintenance. But don't worry, I have lots of ideas for updates. Pinterest is amazing for inspiration these days." David appeared beside them, struggling with a particularly heavy box, his face flushed with effort. "Jess, maybe we should focus on getting settled before we start planning renovations." "I'm just making observations," Jessica said innocently. "Your mother has such good bones to work with here. It just needs a little refreshing." Charlotte felt something cold settle in her stomach as she watched Jessica's gaze sweep across the house that she and Robert had lovingly maintained for over 3 decades. In Jessica's eyes, she could see their home being catalogued and found wanting. The painted shutters too quaint, the garden too informal, the overall aesthetic insufficiently modern for someone of Jessica's sophisticated tastes. "Let me show you to your room," Charlotte said, forcing warmth back into her voice. "We can discuss any changes later." As they moved toward the front door, Jessica paused to examine the brass kickplate that Robert had polished religiously every spring. "This hardware is so retro. It might actually be worth something at an antique store." Charlotte's hand tightened on the door handle, the same handle Robert's fingers had touched thousands of times, and for just a moment she felt his presence so strongly that she almost turned to look for him. But there was only Jessica, already mentally redecorating their foyer, and David, trapped somewhere between his wife's ambitions and his mother's memories. "Welcome home," Charlotte said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure anymore what home meant when someone else was already planning its transformation. As they crossed the threshold, Jessica's voice drifted back to her. "Oh, Charlotte, we really need to do something about this lighting. It's so dim in here." Charlotte closed the door behind them and leaned against it for just a moment, feeling the solid weight of oak that Robert had hung himself. Outside, the U-Haul sat in the driveway like a yellow question mark, full of boxes that suggested this visit might be anything but temporary. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that her carefully preserved sanctuary was about to become something else entirely. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of unpacking and explanations, and the delicate dance of 3 adults learning to share a space that had been hers alone for far too long. But for now, Charlotte straightened her shoulders and prepared to play the role she'd perfected over 6 decades. The gracious hostess, the accommodating mother, the woman who made everyone else comfortable, even when her own world was shifting beneath her feet. After all, that's what good Midwestern women did. They made room. Charlotte woke to the sound of measuring tape retracting in her kitchen. Through the thin walls of the house she and Robert had built 34 years ago, she could hear Jessica's voice, bright and animated, discussing sight lines and flow patterns with someone on speakerphone. The digital clock beside her bed read 7:23 a.m., earlier than Charlotte usually rose, but apparently not early enough to beat her daughter-in-law's renovation enthusiasm. She wrapped Robert's old northwestern robe around her shoulders, a ritual that had become both comfort and armor in the years since his passing, and padded down the hallway in her slippers. The kitchen that greeted her was barely recognizable. Cabinet doors hung open, their contents arranged on every available surface. Jessica stood in the center of the chaos, tablet in hand, speaking to what Charlotte assumed was a contractor, while David hunched over his laptop at the breakfast nook, surrounded by empty coffee cups and job application printouts. David finally looked up, his face pale and strained. "Mom, maybe we should at least look." "David," Charlotte interrupted gently, and something in her tone made him close his mouth. 31 years of being her son had taught him to recognize certain warning signs. "Anyway," Jessica continued, apparently oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, "I've scheduled Brookdale for Thursday at 10, and Sunrise for Friday at 2. Oh, and I changed the Wi-Fi password to something easier to remember. It was some random string of numbers and letters, probably Robert's engineering brain," she added, with a laugh that felt like nails on glass. The password had been their wedding anniversary, followed by the year they'd bought this house. Not random at all, but another small piece of her life Jessica had decided needed improving. "I should mention," Jessica went on, pulling up something on her tablet, "I've organized the cabinets more logically. Cooking implements near the stove, dishes near the dishwasher, basic efficiency principles. I found some expired spices that were probably 10 years old. No wonder nothing had much flavor." Charlotte thought of the spices Robert had brought back from his business trips, the saffron from Spain, the cardamom from India. Some might have been past their prime, but they were souvenirs of their life together, not obstacles to efficiency. "I need coffee," Charlotte murmured, moving toward the machine. "Oh, I moved that," Jessica said helpfully. "It makes more sense on the other counter, closer to the water source. Much better workflow." For 34 years, Charlotte had made her morning coffee in the same spot, where the morning sun hit the counter just right, and she could look out at Robert's garden while the machine gurgled to life. Now it sat in a corner that felt foreign and wrong, like furniture rearranged by strangers. As Charlotte fumbled for the new location of coffee filters, apparently relocated to a more logical cabinet, she caught David watching her with something that might have been guilt. But when Jessica started talking about backsplash options, he turned back to his laptop screen with visible relief. "The Mediterranean look is so overdone," Jessica was saying. "I'm thinking something more contemporary. Clean lines, maybe a soft gray subway tile. Neutral enough to appeal to buyers if you decide to sell." The slip was telling. When, not if. In Jessica's mind, the decision had already been made. Charlotte poured her coffee and retreated to the living room, where she discovered that Jessica's organizational enthusiasm had extended beyond the kitchen. The magazines on the coffee table, Southern Living, Better Homes and Gardens, the local historical society newsletter, had been replaced with Architectural Digest and Modern Home. Robert's reading glasses, which Charlotte had left on his side table as a small comfort, had been moved to a drawer, quote, "to reduce clutter." She found them and put them back, a small act of rebellion that felt both necessary and pathetic. From the kitchen came the sound of Jessica's voice, now discussing paint colors with what sounded like a different contractor. "Earth tones are so aging," she was saying. "We need something that reflects natural light better." Charlotte sat in Robert's chair and looked out at his garden, where the last of the autumn roses were holding on despite the October chill. Like her, they were past their supposed prime but still blooming, still beautiful, still very much alive. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda Martinez next door. "Coffee at 10? Noticed some activity over there?" Charlotte smiled for the first time that morning. Linda had always been observant, a quality that came from 20 years of nursing and raising 3 children largely on her own. If anyone would understand what was happening here, it would be Linda. "Yes," Charlotte typed back. "I could use the perspective." From the kitchen came the sound of another cabinet being opened. More reorganization, more improvement. Jessica's voice carried clearly. "I know it's hard for older people to adapt to change, but sometimes you have to make decisions for their own good." Charlotte's grip tightened on her coffee cup. Older people. Their own good. As if she were a child to be managed, rather than the woman who had built this life, this home, this family. But she said nothing, simply finished her coffee, and went upstairs to shower. In her bedroom, she found that Jessica had helpfully tidied her dresser top, moving Robert's cologne to a drawer and replacing it with a small succulent in a modern geometric planter. Charlotte moved the plant aside and put the cologne back where it belonged. Another small rebellion, another line drawn in sand. As she showered, she could hear Jessica on the phone again, this time discussing hardwood floor refinishing. The woman had been in the house for exactly 14 days and was already planning to erase every trace of the life Charlotte and Robert had built together. By the time Charlotte emerged from her room, dressed and composed, Jessica was spreading fabric samples across the dining room table. "I hope you don't mind," Jessica said without looking up. "I thought we could start with the living room. Something more contemporary, less heavy. The current furniture, chosen piece by piece over decades, each item carrying memories, was apparently too heavy. Too much history, perhaps. Too much evidence of a life lived fully before Jessica arrived to improve it. "Actually," Charlotte said quietly, "I do mind." Jessica looked up, surprised. "Oh, well, we don't have to decide today. I just thought, I mind the assumption that changes need to be made at all," Charlotte clarified, her voice still soft but carrying a new edge. "This is my home, Jessica. These are my choices to make." For a moment, something flickered across Jessica's face. Surprise. Perhaps even annoyance. But it was quickly replaced by the indulgent smile she reserved for unreasonable people. "Of course," she said. "I'm just trying to help. I know how overwhelming these things can be when you've been managing alone." The unfinished sentence hung between them. When you're old. When you're widowed. When you're no longer capable of making good decisions. Charlotte nodded once, then walked to the kitchen where David was still hunched over his laptop, determinedly avoiding eye contact. "David," she said quietly. "A word?" He looked up with the expression of a man who knew he was about to be held accountable for something he'd been pretending not to see. "Mom, I know this is a lot." "Yes," Charlotte agreed. "It is." And with that, she left them both and walked next door to Linda's, where she knew she would find coffee, sympathy, and someone who saw her as Charlotte Langley, not just an old woman whose decisions needed to be made for her own good. Behind her, she heard Jessica's voice resume, bright and confident. "She'll come around. Change is always hard at first." Charlotte paused at Linda's door, Robert's words echoing in her memory. "Know your worth, Charlotte. Don't let anyone convince you you're less than you are." She'd forgotten that lesson somewhere in the year of grief and solitude, but standing on her neighbor's porch, listening to her home being redesigned without her consent, she felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in months. Not anger exactly, something quieter but far more dangerous, determination. The morning air carried the first crisp promise of autumn, as Charlotte walked the familiar path to the Riverside Community Literacy Center, her canvas tote bag filled with reading materials and lesson plans. She'd been making this journey every Wednesday for nearly 8 years, ever since she'd retired from teaching at Columbus East High School. The rhythm of her steps on the cracked sidewalk usually brought her peace, but today her mind churned with the events of the past 2 weeks. Jessica's voice echoed in her memory from breakfast that morning. "I still don't understand why you insist on trudging out to that little volunteer thing every week. Wouldn't your time be better spent helping us get settled? There's so much to organize in the house." Charlotte had simply smiled and gathered her materials, the same way she'd learned to respond to most of Jessica's suggestions. But the word trudging sat heavy in her chest. She didn't trudge anywhere. She walked with purpose, toward people who valued her presence and expertise. The Literacy Center occupied a converted storefront in a strip mall that had seen better days. But inside, the space hummed with quiet transformation. Adult learners worked one-on-one with volunteer tutors, their voices mixing in a gentle symphony of discovery. Charlotte had helped design the program's curriculum, drawing on her decades of classroom experience to create materials that treated adult learners with dignity rather than condescension. Charlotte! Maria Santos looked up from her workbook, her face brightening. I finished the chapter you gave me, the one about the woman who started her own business? Wonderful, Maria. What did you think of Rose's decision to leave her family's restaurant? Maria's eyes grew thoughtful. I think sometimes you have to choose yourself. Even when it's hard. Even when people don't understand. Charlotte felt a flutter of recognition at the words. That's a very wise observation. Family loyalty and personal growth don't always align perfectly, do they? Before Maria could respond, Linda Martinez appeared at Charlotte's elbow, her nurse's scrubs replaced by jeans and a sweater that couldn't quite hide her alert, protective demeanor. Linda had been volunteering at the center for 3 years, but she'd been Charlotte's neighbor and friend for 20. You're quiet today, Linda said, settling into the chair beside Charlotte as Maria returned to her reading. Everything okay with your house guests? Charlotte hesitated. Linda had a way of seeing through polite facades, a skill honed by years of dealing with patients who claimed they were fine while clearly struggling. It's an adjustment, for all of us. Linda's dark eyes narrowed slightly. David's always been easy to get along with. Sweet boy, if a little conflict-averse. Takes after his father that way. The mention of Robert sent a familiar pang through Charlotte's chest. Robert had indeed been a peacekeeper, but he'd also possessed a quiet strength that could emerge when his family needed protection. David had inherited the gentleness but not the steel. It's Jessica who's having trouble adjusting, Charlotte said carefully. She's used to taking charge. Taking charge of what exactly? Before Charlotte could answer, the center's front door chimed, and Henry Wu entered, his silver hair slightly disheveled from the October wind. He spotted Charlotte immediately and made his way over, his engineer's precise gait unchanged, despite his 67 years. Charlotte, good to see you. His smile was warm, but his eyes carried the same concerned expression she'd been seeing more frequently lately. How are you managing with your new arrangements? Fine, Henry. Just fine. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly at her tone. He'd known Charlotte and Robert for over 30 years, had been Robert's business partner and closest friend. He could read the subtle signs of stress in her voice the way he might identify a structural flaw in a building design. If you need anything. Charlotte. The voice that cut through their conversation was bright, artificially cheerful, and unmistakably out of place in the center's quiet atmosphere. All three of them turned to see Jessica approaching, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor. She was dressed for success in a tailored blazer and designer jeans, her makeup perfect despite the early hour. Jessica. Charlotte's voice was carefully neutral. What are you doing here? I came to collect you, of course. Jessica's smile was wide but didn't reach her eyes. I've scheduled those appointments we discussed, the ones at Sunset Manor and Golden Years. I thought we could grab lunch afterward and really talk about your options. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. They had not discussed any appointments. Jessica had mentioned touring senior living facilities exactly once, in passing, while Charlotte was loading the dishwasher. She hadn't agreed to anything. I'm not finished here, Charlotte said quietly. The program runs until noon. Jessica's laugh was light but dismissive. Oh, I'm sure they can manage without you for one morning. Can't you, Linda? She turned to Charlotte's friend with a smile that somehow managed to be both condescending and conspiratorial. You understand how important family time is. Linda's response was measured, professional. Actually, Charlotte coordinates our advanced reading group. She's not easily replaceable. I'm sure you're all very dedicated to your little volunteer activities, Jessica continued, her tone suggesting she found such dedication charming but ultimately frivolous. But Charlotte really needs to start focusing on what's best for her future. For the family's future. The conversation was drawing attention from other volunteers and learners. Charlotte could feel their eyes, could sense the shift in the room's energy. These people knew her, respected her contributions, valued her presence. To them, she wasn't someone who needed to be collected or managed. Henry stepped slightly closer to Charlotte, a subtle gesture of support. Charlotte's been instrumental in developing this program. Her expertise in curriculum design has helped hundreds of adults achieve their literacy goals. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica's smile flickered for just a moment. That's lovely, really, but surely someone else could take over now. Charlotte's at a stage in life where she should be thinking about reducing her commitments, not taking on more responsibility. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Charlotte felt something crystallize inside her chest. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold clarity. Jessica truly believed that Charlotte's age automatically diminished her capabilities, that her widowhood had somehow made her obsolete. The thing is, Linda said conversationally, Charlotte just submitted a proposal to expand the program. The State Literacy Council was so impressed, they've offered her a consultant position to help develop similar programs across Ohio. This was news to Charlotte. Linda was improvising, creating a protective fiction. But the lie revealed a deeper truth. Charlotte was capable of far more than Jessica imagined. Jessica's composure slipped slightly. That's wonderful, but certainly not practical given her current circumstances. I mean, with David and me staying at the house, there's so much to coordinate. The renovations alone will require constant supervision. What renovations? Henry asked sharply. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. She hadn't told Henry about Jessica's kitchen plans, about the contractor estimates, about the casual way her daughter-in-law had begun redesigning her home without permission. Just some updates, Charlotte said quickly. Nothing's been decided. But Jessica was already elaborating, her voice taking on the enthusiastic tone of someone discussing an exciting project. The kitchen is so outdated, we're talking complete gut renovation, and the master bedroom could really use refreshing. Charlotte's been so focused on the past, on Robert's things, that she hasn't been able to see the potential. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken judgment. Charlotte could see the shock in Linda's eyes, the quiet fury building in Henry's expression. These people understood the sacred nature of grief, the importance of moving forward at one's own pace. I think, Henry said carefully, that any decisions about Charlotte's home should be made by Charlotte herself. Jessica's laugh was beginning to sound forced. Of course. I'm just offering suggestions, trying to help. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see what needs to change. Maria Santos had stopped reading and was watching the exchange with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to recognize power dynamics through hard experience. Other learners and volunteers were pretending to focus on their work while clearly listening to every word. Perhaps, Charlotte said quietly, we should continue this conversation at home. But Jessica wasn't finished. I just think it's time for Charlotte to be realistic about her capabilities. These volunteer commitments, living in that big house alone, it's not sustainable. She needs to start thinking about what's practical, what makes sense for someone her age. The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Someone her age. As if her 62 years had somehow disqualified her from making her own decisions, from contributing to her community, from living independently in the home she'd helped build. Linda's voice cut through the tension. Charlotte is one of the most capable people I know. She managed a classroom of 30 teenagers for decades. She's raised 2 successful children. She's been a pillar of this community. I think she knows her own capabilities better than anyone else. I'm sure she was very capable, Jessica said, her emphasis on the past tense unmistakable. But circumstances change. People need to know their place at different stages of life. The phrase hung in the air like a slap. Know your place. Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest. A tectonic movement that she recognized as the moment when accommodation became impossible. You're absolutely right, Charlotte said softly. People do need to know their place. Jessica smiled, apparently missing the steel that had entered Charlotte's voice. Exactly. I'm so glad you understand. Now, about those appointments. I'll meet you at the car in 20 minutes, Charlotte interrupted. I need to finish my commitments here first. For a moment, Jessica looked like she might argue. Then she glanced around the room, seemed to register the hostile stares, and nodded curtly. Fine. 20 minutes. After Jessica left, the center's atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but Charlotte could feel the concerned glances, the unspoken questions. She finished her session with Maria, helped organize materials for the following week, and began gathering her things. Linda walked her to the exit. "Charlotte, honey, we need to talk. What's really going on at your house?" Charlotte paused at the door, looking back at the center where she'd found purpose and community after Robert's death. These people saw her as she truly was, experienced, valuable, capable of growth and contribution. They didn't see someone who needed to know her place in the diminished sense Jessica meant. "I'm beginning to think," Charlotte said slowly, "that I've been too accommodating, too willing to let someone else define what's appropriate for my life." Linda's smile was fierce. "It's about time you realized that. You've got more steel in your spine than Jessica could ever dream of having. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Charlotte looked out at the parking lot where Jessica waited in her car, probably checking her phone and planning the next step in Charlotte's managed decline into irrelevance. "I'm going to figure out exactly what my place is," Charlotte said, "and I have a feeling it's not what anyone expects." As she walked toward the car, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. For the first time since Robert's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The drive home from the literacy center passed in tense silence. Charlotte stared out the passenger window while Jessica navigated the familiar streets with aggressive precision, her frustration evident in every sharp turn and sudden stop. The senior living appointments had been as uncomfortable as Charlotte expected, Jessica asking pointed questions about care levels and availability while Charlotte sat quietly, feeling like a piece of furniture being appraised for donation. "I think Sunset Manor has the most potential," Jessica said as they pulled into the driveway. "The garden units would give you some independence while still providing the support you need. And the timing couldn't be better. They have an opening in December." Charlotte didn't respond. She was looking at her house, her and Robert's house, seeing it through new eyes. The brick facade they'd chosen together, the mature oak trees Robert had planted as saplings, the front porch where they'd spent countless evenings planning their future. Jessica saw it as outdated, inconvenient, a burden. Charlotte saw 35 years of love made manifest. Inside, the house felt different. It took Charlotte a moment to identify why, then she noticed the small changes. Robert's reading glasses were no longer on the kitchen counter where she'd left them that morning. His coffee mug, the one with "World's Best Engineer" that the kids had given him years ago, was missing from its usual spot by the sink. "Jessica?" Charlotte's voice was carefully controlled. "Where are Robert's things?" "Oh," Jessica's tone was bright, artificial. "I did some organizing while you were out. There were just so many little items cluttering the surfaces. I thought it would help the house show better when we start bringing people through." "Show better?" The words came out sharper than Charlotte intended. Jessica paused in removing her jacket, seeming to register Charlotte's tone for the first time. "Well, yes. I mean, eventually you'll want to list the house, right? All these personal items just make spaces feel smaller, more lived in. Potential buyers need to be able to envision their own lives here." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. "Potential buyers?" "Oh, Charlotte." Jessica's voice took on the patient tone one might use with a confused child. "Surely you don't think you can stay here indefinitely? This house is far too big for one person, and the maintenance alone must be overwhelming. David and I have been talking, and we think the smart thing would be to sell while the market is strong. The equity could fund a really nice retirement community placement, and there would probably be something left over for David to finally start his own business." The casual way Jessica discussed dismantling Charlotte's life, as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if Charlotte's wishes were merely obstacles to be managed, left her momentarily speechless. She gripped the back of one of her kitchen chairs, the ones she and Robert had chosen together when they'd first furnished the house. "Where are his things?" Charlotte asked again. Jessica's smile flickered. "I put them in boxes in the garage, just temporarily, to clear the surfaces. I thought you could go through them when you're ready and decide what's worth keeping." "Worth keeping," As if 35 years of shared life could be sorted into categories of value by someone who had known Robert for barely 3 years. Charlotte walked through the house systematically, cataloging the absences. Robert's engineering awards, which had hung in his study, were missing. His books, volumes on structural design, biographies of famous architects, novels he'd loved, were gone from their shelves. Even the small framed photo of them on their wedding day had been removed from the living room mantel. In the garage, she found them. Boxes labeled in Jessica's neat handwriting, Robert's work stuff, old books, random items. 35 years of a man's life reduced to garage sale categories. Charlotte opened the box marked random items and found the coffee mug, the reading glasses, the wedding photo. Her hand shook as she lifted out Robert's favorite sweater, the navy cardigan she'd given him for their 10th anniversary. It still smelled faintly of his cologne. "I know it's hard." Jessica had followed her to the garage, her voice gentle but firm. "But holding on to everything isn't healthy. You need to start letting go, moving forward. Robert wouldn't want you living in the past." The presumption of speaking for Robert, of claiming to know what he would want, sparked something dangerous in Charlotte's chest. Jessica had barely known him. She'd attended a handful of family gatherings, had polite conversations over holiday dinners. She knew nothing about the man who had built this house with his own hands, who had spent evenings in his study working on designs that would outlast his lifetime, who had loved Charlotte with a quiet devotion that had sustained her through decades of joy and sorrow. "You don't know what Robert would want," Charlotte said quietly. Jessica's expression shifted, her patience wearing thin. "I know he'd want you to be practical, to think about David's future, about what's best for the family." "The family?" Charlotte turned to face her fully. "You mean you and David?" "Well, yes. We're the next generation. We're the ones who have to plan for the future, make the hard decisions. You can't expect to hold on to this big house forever, Charlotte. It's not fair to David, and frankly, it's not realistic for someone your age." There it was again, someone your age. As if turning 62 had somehow stripped Charlotte of her right to make decisions about her own life, her own home, her own possessions. "This is my house," Charlotte said. "Mine and Robert's. We bought it, we built it, we raised our children in it." "I understand you have sentimental attachments," Jessica said, her tone becoming more condescending. "But sentiment doesn't pay property taxes or heating bills. It doesn't maintain a roof or fix plumbing. You're living in the past, Charlotte, and it's not healthy. For any of us." Charlotte looked around the garage, at the boxes containing the remnants of her husband's life, at the woman who presumed to know what was best for everyone. Something crystallized in that moment. A recognition that accommodation had become capitulation, that politeness had become a form of self-erasure. "Get out," she said quietly. Jessica blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Get out of my garage. Don't touch Robert's things again. Don't make decisions about my house, my belongings, or my future without my explicit permission." For the first time since moving in, Jessica looked genuinely surprised. "Charlotte, I think you're overreacting. I was just trying to help. You were trying to erase him." Charlotte's voice grew stronger. "You were trying to make this house ready for sale, ready to become someone else's home, ready to stop being ours. You can't live here forever." Jessica's composure finally cracked. "You're being selfish. David deserves a chance to build something of his own, to have a future that's not tied to his parents' past. This house, all this stuff, it's an anchor around his neck." The accusation hung in the air between them. Selfish. As if 40 years of marriage, of building a life and home together, was somehow an imposition on the next generation. As if her very existence, her claim to the space she'd helped create, was unfair to Jessica's plans. "I see," Charlotte said quietly. "You think I'm in the way." Jessica's silence was answer enough. Charlotte began lifting boxes, carrying them back into the house. Jessica watched, her face cycling through frustration, confusion, and something that might have been concern. "What are you doing?" "I'm putting my husband's things back where they belong," Charlotte said. "In his home. The one we built together. The one I'm not selling." "Charlotte, be reasonable." I am being reasonable. Charlotte paused at the garage door, a box of Robert's books in her arms. For the first time in weeks, I'm being perfectly reasonable. This is my house. These are my belongings. My husband's belongings. And I will decide what happens to them. Jessica's face flushed. You can't just ignore reality. You can't live in denial about what's practical. What makes sense? What makes sense, Charlotte said, is that you seem to have forgotten that you're a guest in my home. Guests don't reorganize their host's belongings. They don't make appointments for their hosts without permission. They don't decide what's best for other people's lives. She carried the box inside, leaving Jessica standing in the garage. When she returned for the next box, Jessica was still there, but something had changed in her expression. The confident assumption of authority had been replaced by uncertainty, by the first recognition that her position might not be as secure as she'd believed. "Where's David?" Charlotte asked. "Job interview. He won't be back until late." Charlotte nodded and continued her work. One by one, she reclaimed Robert's possessions, putting his awards back on the walls, his books back on the shelves, his coffee mug back in its place by the sink. Each item restored felt like a small victory, a reclamation of not just space but identity. Jessica watched from the kitchen doorway, her earlier confidence replaced by wariness. "I was just trying to help you move forward." Charlotte placed the wedding photo back on the mantel and turned to face her daughter-in-law. "I will move forward when I'm ready, in the way I choose. And I will decide what that looks like." The phone rang then, breaking the tension. Charlotte answered, grateful for the interruption. "Charlotte? It's Henry." His voice carried concern. "I wanted to check on you after this morning. Linda called me." Charlotte glanced at Jessica, who was listening intently. "I'm fine, Henry, just having some conversations about the future." "Good, that's good. Listen, I was wondering if you might have time for coffee tomorrow. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you. About options you might not have considered." "I'd like that very much." After she hung up, Jessica was still watching her. "What options?" Charlotte didn't answer immediately. She looked around her living room, at the restored photographs and mementos, at the home she'd built with love and intention. For the first time in weeks, it felt like hers again. "I'm beginning to realize," she said finally, "that I have more options than anyone seems to think." That evening, after David returned full of apologies and job interview stress, after Jessica's pointed silence during dinner, Charlotte sat in Robert's study surrounded by his restored belongings. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began making a list, not of things to give away or spaces to redesign, but of resources, connections, possibilities. For too long, she'd allowed others to define her future. Tomorrow, she would begin defining it herself. Outside, autumn rain began to fall, and Charlotte found herself looking forward to morning for the first time since her house guests had arrived. Charlotte arrived at Brewster's Cafe 10 minutes early, choosing a corner table where she could see the entrance and speak privately. The morning rain had stopped, leaving the October air crisp and clean, and she felt more alert than she had in weeks. Last night's confrontation with Jessica had been unsettling, but it had also been clarifying. The fog of grief and politeness that had clouded her judgment was finally lifting. Henry appeared in the doorway, scanning the cafe until he spotted her. At 67, he still moved with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to solving problems, though Charlotte noticed he seemed to be carrying extra weight on his shoulders these days. Robert's death had hit him hard too. They'd been partners for over 20 years, closer than many brothers. "Charlotte." He kissed her cheek before settling across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "You look better than you did yesterday." "I feel better. Clearer." She met his concerned gaze directly. "Henry, I need to tell you what's really been happening at the house." For the next 20 minutes, Charlotte laid out everything. Jessica's renovation plans, the senior living appointments, the casual assumption that the house would be sold, the boxing up of Robert's belongings. Henry listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Jesus, Charlotte." He sat back in his chair when she finished. "That woman has some nerve. She thinks she's being practical, that she knows what's best for everyone. What she's being is presumptuous." And David's just letting this happen? Charlotte's chest tightened. David's struggling. The job loss, the financial pressure. I think he's grateful to have Jessica take charge of things. He's always been conflict-averse. Robert would be furious. The simple statement hit Charlotte with unexpected force. Robert would be furious. He'd protected their family, their home, their decisions with quiet but absolute determination. He'd never let anyone, even well-meaning family, steamroll Charlotte or assume control of their lives. "Henry," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you think I'm being unreasonable? Holding on to the past? Standing in the way of David's future?" Henry's answer was immediate and firm. "Absolutely not. You're 62 years old, Charlotte, not 92. You're sharp, healthy, financially stable, and deeply connected to your community. The idea that you should give up your home and independence because someone else thinks it's practical is insulting. Jessica seems to think the house is too much for me to handle. What does Jessica know about what you can handle? Has she seen you manage a classroom of teenagers? Has she watched you coordinate community programs or handle the logistics of Robert's funeral? Has she seen you navigate insurance claims and legal documents and all the complicated business of being a widow?" Charlotte felt something warm unfurl in her chest. No, she hasn't. Robert always said you were the strongest person he knew. Not the loudest, not the most dramatic, but the strongest. He used to joke that you could run the state of Ohio if you set your mind to it. The memory brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. Robert had indeed said that, usually when she was tackling some impossible organizational challenge at school or in the community. "Tell me about your finances," Henry said gently. "Do you need David's help to maintain the house?" Charlotte shook her head. Robert was thorough about preparing for the future. "The house is paid off, I have his pension, and my teacher's retirement, plus the life insurance and our savings. I'm actually more comfortable financially than I've ever been. And Jessica knows this? I don't think she's ever asked. She seems to assume that widowhood automatically means financial dependency." Henry was quiet for a moment, processing. "Charlotte, I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. That house you and Robert built? It's worth considerably more than you probably realize. The Columbus market has been strong, and your neighborhood has become quite desirable. If you ever did want to sell, and I'm not saying you should, you'd have enough money to do whatever you wanted, wherever you wanted to do it." Charlotte blinked. "I hadn't even thought about that. Here's another thing Jessica probably doesn't know. Robert set up a trust before he died. The house can't be inherited until after your death, and even then, there are conditions. David gets it only if he meets certain requirements about maintaining it for family use. Robert was very specific about protecting your right to live there as long as you wanted." This was news to Charlotte. Robert had mentioned estate planning, but she'd been too deep in grief to focus on the details when the lawyer explained everything after the funeral. "Why didn't I remember that?" "Because you were barely functioning 6 months ago, and legal documents can be overwhelming even under the best circumstances. But the bottom line is this. Jessica's assumption that she and David will inherit the house so they can sell it is wrong. Legally, practically, and morally wrong." Charlotte felt a shift inside herself, like tumblers falling into place in a complicated lock. "What else am I not remembering about my own situation?" Henry smiled. "Well, there's the consulting offer from the State Literacy Council that Linda mentioned yesterday. That was real. It could be. I made a few calls this morning. Your reputation in education circles is stronger than you realize. The state is looking for experienced educators to help expand adult literacy programs, and your name has come up in several conversations. I could arrange a meeting if you're interested." Charlotte stared at him. "You mean I could actually have a job? A career again?" "You could have whatever you want, Charlotte. That's what I'm trying to tell you. You have resources, skills, connections, and legal protections. You're not dependent on David and Jessica's goodwill, and you're certainly not obligated to arrange your life around their assumptions." The cafe hummed with morning conversation around them, but Charlotte felt suspended in a bubble of revelation. For months, she'd been operating from a position of perceived weakness, The grieving widow, the aging mother, the burden to be managed. But that perception was false. Henry, what would you do if you were in my position? I'd make it clear that I was in charge of my own life. I'd establish boundaries that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. And I'd start making plans that excited me, instead of just accommodating other people's plans. Charlotte leaned forward. What kind of plans? Henry's eyes brightened. What have you always wanted to do that you never had time for? What dreams did you put on hold while you were raising kids and building a career? The question opened floodgates Charlotte hadn't even realized existed. I always wanted to travel. Robert and I talked about it, but there was always something. The kids' activities, work obligations, his parents' health issues. We kept saying someday, and then she trailed off. Where did you want to go? Everywhere, but especially Central America. I've been following the literacy work being done in Costa Rica, Guatemala. I used to dream about spending time there, maybe volunteering with their English programs. That's not just a dream, Charlotte, that's completely doable. International volunteer programs are always looking for experienced educators. Charlotte felt dizzy with possibility, but the house would be here when you got back. Or you could rent it out. Or you could spend part of the year traveling and part at home. There are no rules about how you have to live your retirement. The word retirement had always felt like an ending to Charlotte, a stepping back from life. But Henry made it sound like a beginning. What about David and Jessica? What about them? David's a grown man with his own life to figure out. If they need temporary housing, that's one thing. But they don't get to redesign your future to suit their convenience. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the radical shift in perspective. She wasn't a problem to be solved or managed. She was a woman with resources, skills, and decades of life ahead of her. I've been thinking too small, she said finally. You've been thinking like someone who's been told she's in the way. But you're not in the way, Charlotte. You're just getting started. As they prepared to leave, Henry placed a gentle hand on her arm. I want you to promise me something. Before you make any major decisions about the house or your future, talk to me. Let me help you understand all your options. I promise. And Charlotte? Stop letting other people define what's realistic for your life. You've got more power than they know, and it's time you started using it. Walking back to her car, Charlotte felt the October air differently, not as the chill of approaching winter, but as the freshness of change. She had work to do, plans to make, a future to design. And for the first time since Robert's death, that future felt like something she could look forward to, rather than simply endure. When she arrived home, she found Jessica in the kitchen with fabric swatches and paint samples spread across the table. Charlotte! Perfect timing! I wanted to show you the color palette I'm thinking for the renovation. I know change is hard, but I really think you'll love how fresh everything will look. Charlotte looked at the samples, then at Jessica's expectant face, then at her own kitchen, the one she and Robert had designed together, the one that held 35 years of memories. Jessica, she said calmly, we need to talk. The conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, Charlotte was looking forward to it. She knew exactly who she was and what she wanted, and she was ready to stop apologizing for both. The conversation about Jessica's renovation plans had gone better than Charlotte expected, not because Jessica had been receptive, quite the opposite, but because Charlotte had discovered something powerful in her own calm refusal to be swept along by someone else's vision for her life. When Jessica had finally stormed upstairs, muttering about impossible stubbornness, Charlotte had felt not guilt, but relief. Now, 3 days later, she stood in her backyard, preparing for the annual Langley family barbecue, a tradition she'd maintained for 15 years. The October afternoon was perfect, crisp air, golden light filtering through the maple trees that Robert had planted, the last of the season's flowers still blooming in the beds they'd designed together. Mom, you didn't have to do all this? Sarah's voice carried across the yard as she emerged from the house, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her nurse's scrubs replaced by jeans and a sweater that made her look younger than her 26 years. Charlotte smiled at her daughter, feeling the familiar warmth that came with Sarah's presence. Unlike David, Sarah had inherited Robert's quiet strength, along with his gentleness. She'd flown in from Denver that morning, ostensibly to help with the barbecue, but really to assess the situation with David and Jessica. "I enjoy it," Charlotte said, arranging platters on the picnic table. "Besides, it's not just for family anymore. The Martinezes are coming, and Henry and Mrs. Patterson from down the street." "And Jessica's mother?" Charlotte nodded. Eleanor Williams had called earlier that week, expressing her desire to meet Charlotte properly and see where her daughter was staying. Jessica had seemed less than enthusiastic about her mother's visit, which Charlotte found interesting. "There she is now," Sarah said, nodding toward the sliding glass door where Jessica appeared, followed by a tall, elegant woman in her mid-50s whose silver hair was styled in a sleek bob. Eleanor Williams moved with the confident posture of someone accustomed to professional success, but her eyes held a warmth that Jessica's often lacked. She approached Charlotte with a genuine smile. "Charlotte, I'm so grateful to finally meet you properly, and to see your beautiful home. Jessica's told me so much about it." Charlotte wondered exactly what Jessica had said, but Eleanor's tone suggested genuine appreciation rather than criticism. "It's lovely to meet you too, Eleanor. I'm sorry it's taken so long." "Well, life has a way of keeping us busy, doesn't it? But I'm here now, and I have to say, this yard is absolutely gorgeous. You must spend a lot of time maintaining it." Before Charlotte could respond, Jessica's voice cut across the conversation. "Oh, Mom doesn't do the yard work anymore. We've been talking about hiring a service. It's really too much for someone her age." The casual dismissal, spoken in front of Eleanor and Sarah, landed like a slap. Charlotte felt her daughter stiffen beside her, but it was Eleanor whose expression shifted most dramatically. "I'm sorry?" Eleanor's voice carried a note of confusion. "Too much for someone her age? Charlotte, you're what, 62? My neighbor is 75 and still manages her prize-winning rose garden." Jessica's laugh was forced. "Well, it's not just about ability. It's about being practical, focusing energy on what's important. Charlotte has so many other things to think about right now." The sliding door opened again, and David appeared with Henry Wu, both men carrying coolers and wearing the slightly uncomfortable expressions of people walking into uncharted social territory. "Henry!" Charlotte felt genuinely glad to see him. "Thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it. Robert always said these barbecues were the highlight of his year." Henry's eyes swept the gathering, taking in the subtle tensions with an engineer's eye for structural problems. More neighbors arrived over the next hour. Linda Martinez with her signature potato salad, the Pattersons with their new grandbaby, longtime friends who'd known Charlotte and Robert since David and Sarah were children. The yard filled with the comfortable buzz of people who'd shared decades of celebrations together. Charlotte found herself moving through the gathering with renewed energy, playing hostess with the skill that came from years of practice. She noticed Jessica shadowing her movements, interjecting herself into conversations, subtly positioning herself as co-hostess in a way that made Charlotte's guests exchange glances. "Charlotte, this potato salad is incredible," Mrs. Patterson was saying when Jessica appeared at her elbow. "Oh, I'm so glad you like it. I've been experimenting with different recipes. I think the key is using fresher herbs than what Charlotte usually—" "Actually," Linda interrupted smoothly, "I made the potato salad. Same recipe I've used for 20 years. Jessica's smile faltered for just a moment. "Of course. I meant the other dishes. I've been helping Charlotte with the menu planning, making sure everything works together." Charlotte watched this exchange with growing fascination. Jessica seemed compelled to claim credit, to position herself as the real organizer of the event, even when it meant taking credit for other people's contributions. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon. When Henry complimented the garden, Jessica explained her plans for, quote, updating the landscaping. When Eleanor admired the house, Jessica launched into detailed descriptions of the renovations she was helping Charlotte plan. When neighbors asked about Charlotte's volunteer work, Jessica smoothly redirected conversations toward her own insights about what Charlotte really needs at this stage of her life. Sarah, Charlotte noticed, was watching Jessica with the clinical attention of someone accustomed to identifying problematic behavior. Eleanor's expression had grown increasingly uncomfortable as the afternoon progressed. The breaking point came during dessert. Charlotte was serving her famous apple pie, a recipe passed down from Robert's grandmother, when Jessica suddenly clapped her hands for attention. "Everyone, I just want to say how wonderful it's been getting to know Charlotte's friends and neighbors. As David and I have been helping her transition into this new phase of her life, it's been so important to understand her support network." Charlotte felt the words like ice water in her veins. Helping her transition. As if she were a patient requiring management rather than a competent woman hosting a party in her own home. "Of course," Jessica continued, her voice taking on a practiced tone that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment. "There have been some challenges. Charlotte's been having difficulty accepting that she needs more support, more structure. It's natural. Aging brings changes that are hard to acknowledge." The yard had gone very quiet. Charlotte was aware of Linda's sharp intake of breath, of Henry's hands tightening on his coffee cup, of Sarah's face flushing with anger. "For instance," Jessica went on, apparently oblivious to the hostile stares, "Charlotte insists on continuing commitments that are really beyond her capabilities now. The volunteer work, maintaining this big house, even hosting gatherings like this, it's all become too much, but she won't admit it." "Jessica," David's voice was strained, warning. But Jessica was in full flow now, her voice growing more confident as she warmed to her theme. "The family barbecue is a perfect example. All this work, all this stress, when Charlotte should be focusing on her health, on making practical decisions about her future. But she won't listen to reason." Eleanor had gone very still, her face pale. "Jessica, I think perhaps—" "I know it's hard to hear," Jessica interrupted, "but someone has to say it. Charlotte needs to know her place in this family now. She's not the matriarch anymore. She's someone who needs care, someone who needs guidance. The sooner she accepts that, the better off everyone will be." The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte looked around at her guests. People who'd known her for decades, who'd watched her teach their children, organize their community events, support them through crises and celebrations. Their faces reflected shock, anger, and something that looked like protective fury. It was Linda who spoke first, her voice deadly quiet. "Excuse me? I know it sounds harsh," Jessica said, apparently misreading the room entirely. "But sometimes you have to be direct. Charlotte's been struggling with letting go of control, with accepting help. She needs to understand that her role in the family has changed. Her role," Henry repeated slowly, "in her own family, in her own home. Well, yes, David and I are the future of this family now. We're the ones who have to make the hard decisions, the practical choices. Charlotte's had her turn. Now she needs to step back and let us take charge." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Charlotte felt something crystallize inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold clarity that cut through months of confusion and self-doubt. "You're absolutely right," Charlotte said quietly. Jessica's face brightened with surprise and relief. "I'm so glad people do need to know their place," Charlotte continued, her voice carrying across the silent yard. "And I think it's time I made mine very clear." She stood, moving to the center of the gathering, and for the first time in months, Charlotte Langley felt completely, powerfully herself. "This is my home," she said simply. "My yard, my garden, my kitchen, my barbecue. These are my friends, my neighbors, my community. This is my life, built over 35 years with my husband, maintained by my own hands and heart." Jessica's smile was faltering now, uncertainty creeping into her expression. "You're right that I need to know my place," Charlotte continued. "My place is here, in the life I've built, surrounded by people who value my contributions and respect my decisions. My place is not in some assisted living facility chosen by someone else. My place is not stepping aside for other people's convenience." The silence stretched taut. Then Eleanor began to clap. Slowly at first, then joined by Linda, then Henry, then the rest of the gathering. Even David, after a moment's hesitation, joined the applause. Jessica stood frozen in the center of it all, finally understanding that she had fundamentally misread the room, the situation, and the woman she'd so casually dismissed. Charlotte looked at her daughter-in-law with something that might have been pity. "Jessica, I think it's time you learned something important. Knowing your place doesn't mean accepting limitations others impose on you. It means understanding your own worth, your own power, your own right to determine your own life." The barbecue continued around them, but something had shifted permanently. Charlotte had found her voice, her strength, her place, and it was exactly where she'd always been. Charlotte's hand still trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup the next morning, the memory of Jessica's public humiliation playing on repeat in her mind. The kitchen felt different now, not violated as it had when Jessica first began her renovations, but somehow purified by the clarity that came with being pushed too far. Through the window she could see Mrs. Henderson from across the street, deliberately watering her front flower beds, clearly hoping for a chance to catch Charlotte's eye and offer support. The phone had been ringing since 7 a.m., first Linda, then the Kowalskis from next door, then Helen from the Literacy Center. Word traveled fast in their neighborhood, and what Jessica had intended as a public assertion of dominance had instead become a rallying cry for Charlotte's community. Sarah had stayed the night, sleeping in her old room for the first time in 3 years. Charlotte could hear her daughter's voice carrying from the living room, where she'd cornered David before he could escape to his laptop and job applications. 35 years, David. Sarah's voice held a steel that reminded Charlotte of Robert when he was truly angry, quiet, controlled, but unmistakably furious. Mom put her life on hold to help Dad build his business, supported your dreams, paid for your college, and this is how you repay her? By letting your wife treat her like hired help in her own home? You don't understand how complicated. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't you dare tell me it's complicated. I watched Jessica yesterday. I saw her face when she told Mom to know her place. That wasn't frustration or stress, David. That was contempt. Pure, ugly contempt for the woman who raised you. Charlotte moved closer to the doorway, not quite eavesdropping but unable to resist hearing her son's response. There was a long pause before David spoke, his voice smaller than she'd heard it since he was a boy. I know. God, Sarah, I know. I've been telling myself it would get better when I found a job, when we had our own place again. But she's been getting worse, not better. More demanding, more. He struggled for the words. More like she owns everything, including Mom. And what did you do about it? Another silence. Charlotte could picture David's face, the way he'd looked as a child when caught in a lie, ashamed but still searching for an excuse. I wanted to keep the peace. Jessica's been under so much stress with my unemployment, with having to live here when she expected we'd have our own house by now. I thought if I could just find work. You threw Mom under the bus to keep your wife happy. Sarah's words were surgical in their precision. You chose Jessica's comfort over Mom's dignity in her own home. How do you think Dad would feel about that choice? The mention of Robert hit its mark. Charlotte heard David's sharp intake of breath, then what sounded like him collapsing into a chair. He'd be ashamed of me. Yes, he would. Charlotte had to close her eyes against the pain in her son's voice, even as a part of her felt vindicated. Sarah had always been the more direct of her children, the one willing to name uncomfortable truths. It was a quality that had sometimes frustrated Charlotte when Sarah was a teenager, but now she was grateful for her daughter's unflinching clarity. The landline rang again, and Charlotte retreated to the kitchen to answer it, recognizing Eleanor Williams's number on the caller ID. Charlotte? It's Eleanor. Jessica's mother's voice was thick with emotion. I need to apologize for my daughter's behavior yesterday and for not seeing what was happening sooner. Charlotte sank into her chair, surprised by the call. Eleanor had always been polite during family gatherings, but they'd never developed a close relationship. Jessica's mother was a force of nature in the corporate world, recently divorced and fiercely protective of her daughter's ambitions. Eleanor, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Eleanor's voice strengthened. I called Jessica last night after I got home. I told her exactly what I thought of her performance yesterday, and Charlotte, I have never been more disappointed in one of my children. There was a pause, and Charlotte could hear Eleanor collecting herself. I raised Jessica to be strong, to fight for what she wanted. But I never taught her that strength without compassion is just cruelty. And what she did to you yesterday, in front of your friends and neighbors, that was cruel. Charlotte felt an unexpected wave of emotion. Thank you for saying that. I need you to know that not all of Jessica's family supports her behavior. And I need you to know that if you need to make difficult decisions about your living situation, you have my complete support. The careful phrasing wasn't lost on Charlotte. Eleanor was giving her permission to take whatever action she deemed necessary, even if it meant consequences for Jessica and David. I appreciate that more than you know. After Eleanor hung up, Charlotte sat in the sudden quiet of her kitchen, processing the morning's revelations. Through the doorway, she could hear Sarah and David's conversation continuing in lower tones, her son finally beginning to grasp the full scope of what his silence had cost. The back door opened, and Henry Wu stepped inside with the casual familiarity of 20 years of friendship. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression Charlotte had learned to recognize as his problem-solving face. "Coffee's still warm," she offered. But Henry shook his head. "Already had 3 cups. Couldn't sleep after yesterday." He set the folder on the table and studied her face with concern. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected." Charlotte surprised herself with the honesty of that answer. Clearer, somehow, like finally acknowledging something I'd been trying not to see. Henry nodded. "Jessica showed her true colors yesterday. No more pretending it's about stress or adjustment." He tapped the folder. "Linda called me this morning. Said the whole neighborhood's talking about what happened, and not in a way Jessica would like." Before Charlotte could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with emotion and determination. "Mom, I need to talk to you about what's really going on here and about what you're planning to do about it." Charlotte looked between Henry and her daughter, seeing the same protective concern in both their faces. For months, she'd felt increasingly isolated in her own home, her voice diminished and her comfort secondary to Jessica's demands. Now, suddenly, she was surrounded by people who saw her worth and were prepared to fight for her dignity. "Sit down, both of you," she said, gesturing to the kitchen table. "It's time I told you about some plans I've been making." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Plans?" Charlotte smiled, feeling a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. "You remember Dr. Patricia Morales from the university? The one who ran that literacy conference Robert and I attended 3 years ago? The one working in Costa Rica?" Henry's expression shifted to surprise and something that might have been pride. "She contacted me 6 weeks ago. There's a position opening with their English literacy program, 6 months initially, possibly permanent if it works out. It would mean living in San Jose, working with local communities, helping establish reading programs in rural areas." Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I've been accepted. I leave in 3 weeks." Sarah's mouth fell open. "Mom, that's incredible. That's exactly the kind of work you've always talked about doing." "You didn't think I'd actually do it," Charlotte said, reading her daughter's expression. I thought you were too tied to this house, to Dad's memory, to ever really leave." Charlotte reached across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand. "This house will always be here. Your father's memory goes with me wherever I am. But Jessica was right about one thing. I have been living too much in the past. Not because I was weak or afraid, but because I was grieving and needed time. That time is ending." Henry opened his folder, revealing legal documents and financial statements. "Charlotte asked me to help her get everything in order. Irrevocable trust for the house, updated will, power of attorney arrangements. She's been planning this for 2 months. And Jessica has no idea," Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Jessica assumes I'm powerless because I'm older, because I'm widowed, because I've been quiet during her takeover attempt." Charlotte's smile held an edge that reminded both Henry and Sarah that she'd spent 30 years managing classrooms full of teenagers. She's about to learn the difference between choosing to accommodate someone and being forced to submit to them. From the living room came the sound of Jessica's voice, sharp with irritation as she spoke to someone on the phone, probably one of her Chicago friends, complaining about the drama of the previous day. "What about David?" Sarah asked quietly. Charlotte's expression softened. "Your brother is going to have to choose. I love him, and I always will. But I won't sacrifice my dignity or my future to enable his conflict avoidance. He's a grown man, and it's time he acted like one." Henry closed the folder with satisfaction. "When do you want to tell them?" "Tonight. After dinner. I want Jessica to understand exactly what she's accomplished with her campaign to put me in my place." Charlotte's voice carried a quiet satisfaction. "She wanted me to know where I belong. She's about to find out that where I belong is wherever I choose to be, with people who respect and value me." Sarah leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Mom, you magnificent woman. You've been playing chess while Jessica was playing checkers." "Your father always said the best battles are won before the fighting starts," Charlotte replied. "Through careful preparation and understanding your opponent's weaknesses." As if summoned by their conversation, Jessica's voice rose from the living room, demanding that David deal with his family's interference in their marriage. The three at the kitchen table exchanged glances, each hearing the desperation beneath Jessica's anger. "She knows," Henry observed quietly. "Maybe not the details, but she senses the power shifting." Charlotte nodded, rising to refill their coffee cups with steady hands. After months of feeling diminished in her own home, she felt fully herself again. The woman who had commanded respect in her classroom, who had built a marriage and family on mutual care and dignity, who had earned a place of honor in her community through decades of service and kindness. Tonight, Jessica would learn what it truly meant to know your place. And Charlotte would show her that a woman's place was wherever she was strong enough to stand and wise enough to choose. Charlotte stood in her living room looking out at the gathering dusk that painted the maple trees in her front yard deep amber and crimson. The house felt different tonight. Not the oppressive weight of the past months, but something lighter, charged with possibility. Behind her, she could hear the quiet murmur of voices as her invited guests settled into the space that had been her sanctuary, her battlefield, and now would become her launching pad. Linda sat on the sofa beside Henry, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained anticipation. Sarah had flown in that morning, ostensibly for a regular visit, but Charlotte had asked her to stay for this evening. Even Eleanor Williams sat in Robert's old reading chair, having driven down from Toledo after Charlotte's surprising phone call 3 days ago. The woman looked uncomfortable, glancing frequently toward the kitchen where Jessica was audibly expressing her displeasure about the impromptu gathering to David. "I don't understand why she couldn't just tell us whatever this is privately," Jessica's voice carried clearly into the living room. "It's like she's staging some kind of performance." Charlotte smiled slightly. Jessica had always been perceptive about manipulation, just not about her own. The irony wasn't lost on Charlotte that the woman who had spent months orchestrating elaborate schemes to control the household was now suspicious of anyone else's careful planning. David entered the living room first, his face drawn with the exhaustion that had become his constant companion since the barbecue 3 weeks ago. The community's reaction to Jessica's public humiliation of Charlotte had been swift and decisive. Invitations had dried up, the warm greetings at the grocery store had turned coolly polite, and more than one neighbor had made pointed comments about respect for elders. David had finally begun to see the damage his silence had caused, but he still moved through the house like a man walking on broken glass. Jessica followed, her designer jeans and carefully styled hair a stark contrast to her sour expression. She took the remaining chair with the air of someone attending a funeral, crossing her arms and fixing Charlotte with a look that managed to combine martyrdom with barely suppressed hostility. "Well," Jessica said, her voice sharp with impatience. "We're all here. What's this about, Charlotte?" Charlotte took her place, standing near the mantelpiece, where Robert's photograph watched over the gathering with his gentle smile. She had thought about this moment for months, imagining different versions, different outcomes. But now, with all the players assembled and her plans finally ready to unfold, she felt only a deep, settling calm. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and warm. "I know this seems a bit formal, but I have some announcements to make that will affect all of us, and I wanted everyone to hear them at the same time." She paused, letting her gaze move around the room, noting the varying expressions of curiosity, concern, and in Jessica's case, barely concealed irritation. "First," Charlotte continued, "I want to share some wonderful news. I've been accepted into the Costa Rica Literacy Initiative, a program run by the International Education Foundation. They've selected me to help establish English literacy programs in rural communities, starting with a 6-month commitment in January." The silence that followed was profound. Linda's face broke into a delighted grin, while Henry nodded with obvious pride. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. Eleanor looked surprised but pleased. David's mouth had fallen slightly open, and Jessica looked as if Charlotte had announced she was joining the circus. "Costa Rica?" David finally managed. "Mom, that's incredible, but are you sure? I mean, at your age." "At my age," Charlotte interrupted gently, "I have finally reached a point where I can pursue opportunities I've always dreamed about, which brings me to my second announcement." She moved to the small secretary desk in the corner and withdrew a thick manila folder, setting it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. "Many of you may have been under certain misconceptions about my financial situation," she said, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her words. "Perhaps because I've lived modestly, or because widows are often assumed to be dependent on their children's generosity. I want to clarify a few things." Jessica's posture had shifted, her arms uncrossing as she leaned forward slightly. David looked confused, while the others waited with obvious interest. "Robert and I were very fortunate in our investments over the years. In addition to his engineering pension and my teacher's retirement, we made some quite successful real estate investments in the 1990s. We also inherited property from my parents that has appreciated considerably." Charlotte opened the folder and withdrew several official-looking documents. "The current value of our combined assets is approximately $3 million. The number hung in the air like a crystal chandelier, beautiful and fragile and utterly transformative. David's face had gone pale, while Jessica's showed a progression of emotions from shock to confusion to something that looked remarkably like panic. "Furthermore," Charlotte continued, 3 years ago Robert and I established an irrevocable trust with Henry's firm handling the legal work. This house, along with our primary investments, cannot be sold, transferred, or inherited until I choose to activate those provisions. Should anything happen to me, Sarah has been named primary trustee, with specific instructions about the property's care and eventual distribution." Sarah nodded, her expression solemn. "Mom asked me to review everything last year. I've been honored to accept that responsibility." Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. But David said, "I mean, we thought." She stopped, seeming to realize that anything she said would reveal the depth of her assumptions about inheriting Charlotte's home. "You thought what, dear?" Charlotte asked, her tone genuinely curious. Jessica's face flushed red. "I just assumed that as David's wife, we would eventually. I mean, the house is so big for just one person, and we've been talking about starting a family." "Have you?" Charlotte's eyebrows rose slightly. "David? You haven't mentioned wanting children. When did this conversation happen?" David shot a panicked look at Jessica, then back at his mother. We've talked about it generally, in the future." "Maybe? I see." Charlotte's voice remained neutral, but Linda made a small sound that might have been a suppressed snort. "Well, that brings me to my third announcement." She withdrew another set of papers from the folder. "The Costa Rica position, if I choose to extend it, could become permanent. They're looking for someone to help establish a regional training center, and frankly, the idea of spending my remaining years doing meaningful work in a beautiful place is quite appealing." Eleanor spoke for the first time since arriving. "Charlotte, that sounds absolutely wonderful. What an adventure at this stage of life." "Thank you, Eleanor. Your support means a great deal to me." Charlotte smiled at Jessica's mother, noting how the older woman's approval seemed to further unsettle her daughter. Of course, this doesn't mean I'm abandoning family or Ohio permanently. I'll maintain the house and return regularly. But it does mean I'll be living my life according to my own priorities and timeline. She set the papers back in the folder and looked directly at David and Jessica. Which brings me to the practical matters affecting your current living situation. Jessica's hands had clenched into fists in her lap. What kind of practical matters? You're both welcome to continue living here while I'm away, under certain conditions. Charlotte's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath now. First, the house remains exactly as it is. No renovations, no redecorating, no changes to the fundamental character of the home Robert and I built together. Second, all household decisions, from grocery shopping to maintenance, will be handled according to my instructions, which Sarah will oversee during my absence. David started to speak, but Charlotte held up a gentle hand. Third, you'll both contribute to household expenses, according to your means. I've prepared a modest rental agreement that reflects current market rates for a home of this size and location, with utilities split proportionally. She handed David a document from the folder. Henry's firm drew this up. I think you'll find the terms quite reasonable, certainly more reasonable than what you'd pay for comparable housing elsewhere in Columbus. Jessica shot to her feet, her face now bright red with anger and humiliation. You can't be serious. We're family. You can't charge your own son rent to live in his childhood home. Jessica? Charlotte's voice carried a new quality, something that made everyone in the room straighten slightly. This is my home. Robert and I purchased it, maintained it, and loved it for 35 years. David lived here as a child because he was our dependent child. He's now a 31-year-old married man whose wife has spent the last 6 months treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own house. The words hung in the air with devastating clarity. Even David flinched. But more importantly, Charlotte continued, her voice softening slightly, I'm offering you both an opportunity to build something of your own while having the security of family support. That's more generous than many families would provide. Jessica's eyes were bright with tears now. Whether from anger or humiliation, Charlotte couldn't tell. You've been planning this. All of it. While we've been trying to help you adjust to widowhood and figure out your future, you've been scheming behind our backs. I've been taking care of myself, Charlotte corrected calmly. Something I've been doing successfully for 62 years, despite what you may have assumed about my capabilities. Henry cleared his throat. If I may add something here, he said, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years in business. Charlotte asked me to review her financial situation after your arrival because she was concerned about some comments regarding her need for assisted living and the house being, quote, too much for her to handle. What we discovered was that she's in an enviable position for retirement, financially independent, intellectually engaged, and physically healthy. The Costa Rica opportunity came about because she's been quietly maintaining her professional network and pursuing her interests. This isn't a woman who needs managing. This is a woman ready for her next adventure. Jessica turned to David, desperation clear in her voice. Are you going to just sit there and let them do this to us? To your family? David looked between his wife and his mother, and for the first time in months, Charlotte saw something in his expression that reminded her of Robert, a quiet strength finally asserting itself. Jessica, he said slowly, Mom isn't doing anything to us. She's offering us a place to live at reasonable terms while we get back on our feet. A lot of parents wouldn't be that generous after. He trailed off, but everyone in the room knew what he meant. After the way you've treated her. After the way I've let you treat her. Jessica stared at him for a long moment, then grabbed her purse from the side table. I need some air, she said tightly. I need to think. She strode toward the front door, then paused and turned back. You know what, Charlotte? You're right about one thing. I never really knew who you were. I thought you were just a lonely old woman who needed our help. I was wrong about that. Her voice carried a note of genuine surprise along with the anger. But I still think this whole production is manipulative and cruel. Jessica, the voice came from Eleanor, who had risen from her chair. I think you should take that walk, dear. We'll talk when you get back. Jessica looked at her mother with something approaching betrayal, then left without another word. The front door closed with more force than necessary, and through the window they could see her striding down the street in the gathering darkness. Eleanor remained standing, her face troubled. I owe you an apology, Charlotte. I had no idea how Jessica has been behaving. She led me to believe that you were struggling with independence, and that they were providing necessary support. Thank you for saying that, Charlotte replied. Though I suspect Jessica convinced herself that was true. It's easier to justify taking control when you frame it as helping. David had been staring at the rental agreement in his hands, but now he looked up at his mother with something that might have been the beginning of respect. Mom, he said quietly, I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing what was happening. For not protecting you. For forgetting who raised me. Charlotte moved to sit beside her son on the sofa, taking his hand in both of hers. David, sweetheart, you're not responsible for Jessica's choices. But you are responsible for your own. And there's still time to make better ones. The room fell into a comfortable quiet, broken only by the soft tick of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of Linda quietly weeping with what looked like proud joy. Outside, the streetlights had come on, casting long shadows across the lawn where Robert had once taught David to throw a baseball and where Charlotte had tended her roses for decades. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for Costa Rica. Tonight, for the first time in months, Charlotte Langley sat in her own living room, knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged. And that place, she realized with quiet satisfaction, was anywhere she chose to be. The streetlights cast long shadows across Charlotte's living room as the last of her guests departed, leaving only David sitting across from her, the rental agreement still clutched in his hands. The house felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if it too was preparing for the changes ahead. Mom, David said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need to tell you something. Charlotte settled back into her chair, noting how her son looked younger somehow, stripped of the brittle defensiveness that had armored him for months. I'm listening. I knew. The words came out in a rush. Not everything, but I knew Jessica was. I knew she was being disrespectful. I heard her on the phone with her friends, complaining about having to live with David's elderly mother, and how you were stuck in the past. He looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I told myself she was just frustrated about my job situation, that she didn't mean it. Charlotte felt her heart clench. Not just for herself, but for the pain so clearly etched across her son's face. Why didn't you say anything? Because I was ashamed. David's voice cracked. I was 31 years old, unemployed, living in my childhood bedroom. Jessica kept saying we needed to, quote, take charge of our future, and that you needed us to make decisions for you. It made me feel useful, I guess. Like I was finally being the man of the house Dad always wanted me to be. Oh, sweetheart. Charlotte moved to sit beside him on the sofa. Your father never wanted you to be anything other than yourself. A good man who treats people with kindness and respect. I forgot that, David said, leaning into his mother's embrace like he had as a child. I got so caught up in trying to prove I could provide for Jessica, could give her the life she wanted, that I forgot everything you and Dad taught me about what really matters. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before David pulled back, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Jessica's not a bad person, Mom. She grew up differently. Her parents divorced when she was 12, and her mom spent years fighting her dad over money and property. Jessica learned to see everything as a competition, as something to be won or lost. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. That explains a great deal, but it doesn't excuse the way she's treated you or me or this family. I know, and I'm going to talk to her about that. David's voice carried a new firmness. Actually, I've been thinking about a lot of things since the barbecue. About what I want from my marriage, from my life. About the kind of man I want to be. And what have you decided? David looked around the living room, his gaze settling on his father's photograph. I want to be someone Dad would be proud of. Someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Charlotte squeezed his hand. He was proud of you, David. Every day of his life. Just like I am. Even after everything that's happened? Especially after tonight. It takes courage to admit when you've made mistakes. It takes even more courage to change. The front door opened quietly, and Jessica stepped inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold night air. She paused when she saw them sitting together on the sofa, something vulnerable flickering across her face before she straightened her shoulders. David, we need to talk, she said, her voice carefully controlled. We all need to talk, David replied, standing but keeping his mother's hand in his. But first, you owe my mother an apology. Jessica's jaw tightened. I don't think I'm the only one who owes apologies here. You're right, Charlotte said, rising gracefully. I owe you an apology for not addressing this situation directly months ago. I should have been clearer about my expectations and boundaries from the beginning. The admission seemed to catch Jessica off guard. She blinked several times before responding. That's not what I expected you to say. I've had a lot of practice at being honest tonight, Charlotte replied with a slight smile. It's surprisingly liberating. Jessica looked between Charlotte and David, and some of the rigid tension in her posture began to soften. My mother called me while I was walking. She was not happy with my behavior. Eleanor is a wise woman, Charlotte said. What did she tell you? That I've been acting like a spoiled child, and that she raised me better than that. Jessica's voice was tight with emotion. She said that if I couldn't see the gift in having a mother-in-law who welcomed me into her home and tried to support our marriage, then I was too blind to deserve either. The honesty of it hung in the air between them, raw and painful and necessary. She was right, Jessica continued, her voice breaking slightly. I came into your home with all these assumptions about what you needed, what we deserved, what the future should look like. I never once asked you what you wanted. I just assumed you didn't matter as much as our plans. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at the genuine remorse in Jessica's voice. Thank you for saying that. I'm sorry, Charlotte. I'm sorry for treating you like an obstacle instead of family. I'm sorry for dismissing your feelings and your autonomy. And I'm really sorry for humiliating you in front of your friends and neighbors. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know I have a lot of work to do to earn that. David stepped forward and gently took his wife's hands. We both do. I should have protected you, Mom, and I should have supported you, Jess, without letting either of you tear each other apart. I failed both of you. Marriage is hard, Charlotte said softly. Building a life with someone means constantly choosing to see them clearly and love them anyway. It means growing together instead of trying to make each other smaller. Jessica looked at Charlotte with something approaching wonder. How did you and Robert make it work for 35 years? We remembered that we were on the same team, Charlotte replied. Even when we disagreed, even when we hurt each other's feelings, we never forgot that we were building something together. And we never stopped talking to each other. Really talking, even when the conversations were difficult. I want that, Jessica said, her voice small. I want us to be a real family. All of us. Then that's what we'll work toward, Charlotte said. But it starts with honesty. About what we need, what we can give, and what we're willing to change. David nodded. The rental agreement is fair, Mom. More than fair. And you're right about us needing to contribute and take responsibility for our own lives. What about Costa Rica? Jessica asked. Are you really going? Charlotte's face lit up with genuine excitement. I really am. It's something I've dreamed about for years, using my teaching skills to help communities that need it most. I feel more alive thinking about it than I have since Robert died. That's actually amazing, Jessica said, and Charlotte could hear that she meant it. I've been so focused on what I thought you should be doing that I never asked what you wanted to be doing. Well, Charlotte said with a smile, now you know. And now we can start building something better for all of us. Outside, the November wind rustled through the maple trees, carrying away the last of autumn's leaves and making room for whatever was coming next. Inside, 3 people sat in the warm light of the living room, no longer quite the same family they had been that morning, but perhaps, with time and effort and love, something even better. The work of rebuilding trust would take time, but for the first time in months, Charlotte Langley looked around her living room and saw not just her past, but her future, rich with possibility and wholly, entirely her own. The Costa Rican sunrise painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose as Charlotte sat on the small balcony of her apartment in San Jose, her laptop open and a cup of locally grown coffee steaming beside her. 3 months had passed since she'd left the snowy streets of Columbus for this vibrant country, and every morning still felt like a gift. "Buenos dias, Profesora Charlotte," called Maria, one of her students, as she walked past the building on her way to the market. Charlotte waved back, marveling at how quickly she'd become part of this community's daily rhythm. Her phone chimed with a video call notification. Sarah's face appeared on the screen, grinning broadly from what looked like her kitchen in Denver. "Mom, you look incredible." "Is that a tan?" Charlotte laughed, touching her face self-consciously. "I suppose it is. I've been helping with the outdoor literacy programs in the rural communities. Yesterday I taught a grandmother of 7 how to read her first complete sentence. She cried, Sarah. We both did." "That's amazing." "I'm so proud of you." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "I have an update from Columbus. David got the job." "The one with the engineering firm downtown?" "That's the one. He starts Monday." "And Jess?" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's been different since you left. Really different." Charlotte set down her coffee cup, giving her daughter her full attention. "Different how?" "She enrolled in that program you suggested, the one about elder care and intergenerational relationships. But more than that, she's been volunteering at the senior center where you used to read to residents. Linda told me Jessica asked specifically to help with their literacy program." Charlotte felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the tropical sun. "That's wonderful news." "There's more. She's been maintaining your garden exactly as you left it, and she had David help her frame some of Dad's old photographs to display properly instead of keeping them stored away." "The house?" Sarah smiled. "It looks like home again." They talked for another 20 minutes about Sarah's work, her husband, and the small details of life that felt precious across the distance. After they hung up, Charlotte remained on the balcony, watching the city wake up below her. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, got the job. Jessica wants to call you later to share some news. We miss you, but we're proud of what you're doing. Dad would be too." Charlotte smiled, remembering the conversation she'd had with Jessica just 2 weeks after arriving in Costa Rica. Her daughter-in-law had called, crying, to apologize again and to tell Charlotte about the elderly woman at the senior center who reminded her of her own grandmother, the one person who had shown her unconditional love during her parents' bitter divorce. "I never understood how much I missed having that kind of wisdom in my life," Jessica had said through tears. "I thought independence meant rejecting everything from previous generations, but I was just cutting myself off from so much knowledge and love." That conversation had marked a turning point. Jessica began sending Charlotte photos of the garden, asking for advice about Robert's rose bushes. She'd started cooking from Charlotte's old recipe cards, texting pictures of her attempts and asking for guidance. Slowly, tentatively, they were building something new, not the relationship of convenient coexistence they'd had before, but something deeper and more genuine. Charlotte's work phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Charlotte, it's Miguel," said her program coordinator. "The regional director wants to meet with you this afternoon. Are you free?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" "More than all right. I think you'll be very pleased with what she has to say." That afternoon, Charlotte sat across from Dr. Carmen Vasquez, the Regional Director of Educational Initiatives, in a bright office overlooking the Central Valley. "Charlotte, your work here has been exceptional," Dr. Vasquez began. "The communities you've worked with have shown remarkable progress, and your innovative approaches to adult literacy are exactly what we need to expand our programs." Charlotte felt her heart skip. "Thank you. This work has been the most fulfilling of my career." Which brings me to my proposition. We're establishing a new regional training center, and we need someone to head the adult literacy division. It would mean a permanent position, a substantial salary increase, and the opportunity to train educators from across Central America. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. "We'd like to offer you the position." Charlotte stared at her, speechless. This was beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd first applied for the program. I'm honored, truly. But I need to think about it. My family." "Of course. Take all the time you need. We understand that family considerations are important, especially for someone who has given so much to others throughout her career." Walking home through the bustling streets, Charlotte felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. This opportunity represented everything she'd dreamed of: meaningful work, financial independence, and a chance to make a lasting impact. But it also meant committing to a life far from the people and places that had shaped her. That evening, she called Henry. "Charlotte, how's paradise treating you?" "It's treating me very well. Almost too well, actually." She told him about the job offer, and the silence that followed was thoughtful rather than surprised. "You know," Henry said finally, "Robert and I used to talk about this kind of thing. He always said that the best decisions weren't about choosing between good and bad, but about choosing between different kinds of good." What did he mean? That you can't make a wrong choice if you're choosing between things that align with your values. The question isn't what's right or wrong, it's what feels most like you. After they hung up, Charlotte sat on her balcony again, watching the city lights twinkle in the warm darkness. She thought about the past year, the pain of Robert's death, the months of feeling invisible and unwanted in her own home, the slow rebuilding of relationships with David and Jessica, and now this unexpected flowering of possibility. Her laptop chimed with an email from Jessica. "Charlotte, I hope you don't mind, but I've been reading some of your old teaching journals that David found in the basement. Your ideas about education and community are amazing. I've been sharing some of them with the literacy program here, and everyone is so impressed. I know I have no right to ask, but would you consider doing a video call with our volunteer group? They'd love to hear from you." Charlotte smiled, typing back, "I'd be honored to talk with your group. How about next Tuesday?" As she prepared for bed, Charlotte realized that Henry was right. This wasn't about choosing between good and bad options. It was about choosing between different expressions of the same fundamental truth about who she was. Whether she stayed in Costa Rica or returned to Columbus, whether she built something new here or rebuilt something stronger there, she would be honoring the same core values: service, growth, and the belief that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. The next morning, Charlotte woke early and walked to the small church where she'd been volunteering with their literacy program. As she watched her students, ranging in age from 16 to 75, work through their reading exercises, she felt the familiar surge of joy that came from witnessing someone discover their own capability. After class, she pulled out her phone and typed a message to her family group chat. "I have some exciting news to share. Are you all free for a video call this weekend?" The responses came quickly. Sarah with several excited emojis, David with "can't wait to hear," and Jessica with "whatever it is, we're proud of you." Charlotte smiled, sliding her phone back into her pocket. She knew what she wanted to do. More importantly, she knew who she was. Not the diminished widow Jessica had first encountered, not the dependent mother David had worried about, but Charlotte Langley, teacher, world traveler, woman of strength and purpose. And her place, she had finally learned, was anywhere she chose to plant her roots and grow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,